A young child lies motionless on a park bench. Just minutes before, he was playing with his mother's partner. The man is 39-year-old Marvyn Iheanacho, a serial domestic abuser with a violent temper.
It was something that was going to happen because of his nature and the character.
A lost shoe in the park leads to a vicious beating.
And Alex was replying with, I'm sorry, but Marvyn just had blinders on and he was beside himself with rage.
5-year-old Alex Malcolm is left fatally injured.
This is a truly horrific case, and what makes it all the more tragic is that Alex Malcolm should never have been in his care. Marvyn Iheanacho had committed a litany of previous offences, including battering a former partner and attempting to strangle her 13-year-old son.
1 in 5 murders in the UK is now committed by an ex-prisoner. From serial rapists
he harboured dark thoughts about carrying out sexual offences
to convicted killers.
They'd met in prison, they were out on the streets together.
Free to walk amongst us.
They knew he could have killed again.
Free to murder innocent people.
She stabbed him many times, and then she hid him in a wheelie bin.
I'm Donald McIntyre, and I'm examining how such tragedies happen. Who's to blame? Is it the justice system?
Or are these killers just pure evil?
She gained pleasure from hurting people.
And ultimately, could an innocent life have been saved? This is Released to Kill. Marvyn Iheanacho was born in 1978 and grew up in Hounslow, West London. As a teenager, he starts to show signs of having a violent temper.
So Marvyn Iheanacho's first conviction for violence, certainly against a partner, was in 1998. He was at the age of 19. His girlfriend asked him to borrow £5. He refused, and it resulted in him attacking her severely around the head and body.
This is the start of a long history of violent offences that will see Iheanacho in and out of prison for the next 18 years.
It was really clear from viewing his criminal history that he had issues with rage. You know, he's a big guy and he used his physicality, he used his arms, he used his feet, and he fought and scrapped in a lot of those incidents.
Between 1998 and 2015, Iheanacho has 6 convictions for domestic abuse. They're all sparked by trivial incidents. One of his partners refuses to lend him her car. He then bashes her with a saucepan and stamps on her face. When the woman's stepson tries to intervene, he hits him and kicks him in the head. 2 years later, another partner refuses to lend him her phone. He erupts into a violent rage.
Kicked her in the head, knocked her unconscious, fractured her jaw, which required surgery, and there was a linked second assault on the same partner. Slightly less injuries caused as a result, but nonetheless, those 2 assaults were taken together. He was convicted of those assaults, and he was sent to prison.
It's quite clear from this individual's history of offending that his violence is really generally within relationships, and that to me is entirely indicative of serious attachment difficulties.
People that attack their partners are often, what we would call, controllers, narcissists, and it's very, very subtle, and it just starts to kind of creep in. And often in those first throws, they kind of, the woman might say, oh, well, yeah, but I still love him. Oh, it'll be all right.
Narcissistic personality disorder causes people to have an inflated sense of their own importance and a lack of empathy for others.
I do think it's likely that he would meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, which is seen as a mental disorder. Here we'd be thinking about long-term significant psychotherapy.
In 2015, Iheanacho attacks his girlfriend because she refuses to put items in a bin. Yet again, his rage takes over. He lashes his girlfriend repeatedly with a belt, pinning her by the neck and forcing a bottle into her face. He's convicted of common assault and finds himself back behind bars.
Since the age of 19, Iheanacho has been in and out of prison for domestic abuse. But what makes such a violent criminal? And were there any warning signs of the murderous man he'd become?
Joining me in the Crime Hub are Dr. Shahom Daz, a consultant psychiatrist, and Adrian Smith, a former senior probation manager.
Marvyn Iheanacho is incredibly violent. How do you account for this? Was he born bad, or was this something he learned?
And what we know now is that it's a bit of both. So there are genetic influences, but obviously environmental factors play a big role as well. So for example, being exposed to violence, witnessing domestic violence between family members, between parents, and just basic poverty and social deprivation. So it's all mixed together that contributes.
In terms of the prosecution of domestic violence cases, and particularly repeat offenders like this, how do the courts handle them?
These type of offences can be difficult to prosecute. You need to have a witness. Often the witness is the abused person. They may be reluctant to give evidence. They may still have an investment in the relationship. These things happen behind closed doors, so it's one person's word against another's.
So what are the red flags that would stand out for an offender like Iheanacho when he comes to you?
Well, the starting point always has to be the previous convictions.
I completely agree with Adrian. I think the previous violence is the most important and significant risk predictor for future violence.
Effectively, psychological assessments are not routinely done for perpetrators of domestic violence. And if one had been done on Iheanacho after his first few offences, what difference would that have made?
So if Iheanacho was sent to a psychiatric unit as opposed to a prison, so if he was sectioned, possibly for a temporary period of time, he'd have had a very thorough psychological assessment. And as well as asking him particular questions about his beliefs and his values, we'd also, as a team, make the effort to look into his past to get objective evidence. So we'd be looking through his medical notes, previous psychological assessments, general practice notes, potentially even speaking to family members, ex-partners, for example. So it's a very holistic, thorough type of assessment. Unfortunately, we don't really have the resources or the time to do that in prison.
But at this stage, early on in his career, offending career, as a relatively young man, none of his crimes seem to trigger this kind of intervention. Doesn't that show that there's something incredibly lacking in the system?
So I do think the very fact that there's such a clear pattern in his behaviours, the very fact that his offences are very similar, violence against women, even previous violence against a child, is worrying. And as that escalates, then services should increase their level of supervision and their level of concern. So I absolutely agree, it does seem that it was swept under the carpet to a degree. It doesn't seem to be much scrutiny.
Iheanacho has a history of violent assault dating back to his teens. And he has a particular tendency to explode over trivial matters and take his rage out on anyone who gets in his way. Although locked up in prison, it's clearly only a matter of time before this terrifying aggression leads to a fatal assault.
Iheanacho's repeated pattern of violence, sparked by minor issues, is extremely worrying.
He's triggered by challenges, affronts to his authority, even if these are minute, what you or I would consider as tiny, everyday occurrences. We're really thinking about somebody who is so vulnerable to rejection, and on top of that is very vulnerable to perceiving somebody criticizing or challenging him. We can quite quickly see how dangerous he is.
For each of his convictions, Iheanacho has only received a short sentence. This hasn't allowed time for him to receive the psychiatric care he needs.
It's very difficult to rehabilitate somebody who's actually only doing a short sentence. You don't have time, really, to do anything. Support-wise, I mean, you can do as much as you can do and as much as that prisoner wants to engage with.
2/3 of people sentenced to a prison term of 6 months or less go on to commit a further crime within a year of being released.
I've always thought that short sentences, certainly under 12 months, are a waste of time. Or, you know, you might say, well, it gives the community a bit of a rest, But then the person's had no chance to really change, no chance to learn a skill, no chance to address his offending behaviour. They're totally ineffective.
Marvyn Iheanacho is serving an 8-month prison sentence in Wormwood Scrubs for common assault. During that time, he commences a pen-pal relationship with a woman on the outside. Her name is Lilia Braha.
Lilia is from Ukraine. She was a student here, and then she had a relationship, which is where Alex was born.
Lilia and Alex's father were together for 2 years, but then the relationship comes to an end. Now at home with a young child, a mutual friend puts her in touch with Iheanacho and she starts writing to him.
He told her that he was being released early because he was not guilty. She's European, she didn't understand the British justice system, she just believed him.
Lilia continues her pen-pal relationship throughout Iheanacho's sentence, little knowing the grave danger she's in.
Well, it's quite clear that Lilia had no idea the extent of the violence and his violent past when she let him into her life.
Do you identify a problem here, which appears to be that he perpetrated offences and he was charged on the lighter end of that potential?
It's part of that same picture of domestic abuse not always being charged at all, and lack of evidence, sometimes plea bargaining. That could well explain why often domestic abuse is lightly charged.
Because if he was charged with a higher degree of crime, potentially attempted murder rather than a domestic violence, then that would have triggered, obviously, a much greater intervention much earlier.
Yeah, that's correct. So it's about whether the police feel they've got enough evidence, whether the Crown Prosecution Service themselves want to escalate it to a harsher charge, depending on whether they think they're going to be successful. And I think another issue that can't be overstated is the dynamics in the courtroom itself. So if, for example, the defence barrister is more persuasive than the prosecution barrister, then it's likely that the defendant's going to have a positive outcome from their perspective.
For inmates on a short sentence for whatever crime, what is the prospect of any rehabilitation?
I think pretty well nil, frankly. There's not going to be sufficient time for him to undertake any programs within the prison service in such a short sentence. He's going to be focused on getting out of the door, completing his sentence. He's going to be developing some of those skills and techniques that he has to get his own way, his bullying behaviour, his intimidation of others. That's how you survive on a prison wing, and that's what he will be doing.
So far from being rehabilitated, his risk may be amplified. He may be a greater risk coming out than going in.
It's absolutely true. It may be amplified.
Adrian, the issue of pen pals in prison, what risks run with that?
Clearly, you don't know who you're writing to, who you're in contact with. The prison does have a responsibility to censor certain mail. I'm not sure that always works terribly well.
But those who are censoring those letters wouldn't necessarily know the background. They saw a child mentioned as part of a, one family setup which Iheanacho was connecting with. This may be a red flag to somebody who knew his case, but not necessarily to a civilian who's censoring it in the prison service.
That's absolutely right, and there will be an offender supervisor on the wing whose job is to understand that and know about that. But the likelihood that he's the one that's reading the mail each morning, I guess, is quite low.
And for the recipient of these pen pal engagements, and I suppose there's a presumption that the prison service would intervene if it was a dangerous engagement.
Well, I think it's a really murky and complicated area, isn't it? Because it's all about people taking personal responsibility to do their own background research versus how much trust they put into the professionals. But I think when you have a system that's so overstretched, there's barely enough prison officers to be on the landings, then it's easy to see how some of these tertiary kind of events get overlooked.
There's a stigma attached to some crimes, like sex crimes. What kind of stigma would he have suffered from the crimes he was committing, domestic abuse?
So I think there is absolutely a hierarchy within prisoners, and at the bottom of that hierarchy are paedophiles and rapists. And then the next rung from the bottom are people who commit violence towards women and children. So I think absolutely he would have been potentially targeted if the other inmates found out about the nature of his offence.
Was it possible he could have disguised his offences to his fellow inmates?
Highly likely. There's no reason that he's likely to admit to the details of the offence.
Iheanacho could have become more adept over time because he's told this story and he's minimised it and he's coated it in lies so many times in the prison system, just so that he doesn't push himself right to the bottom of the hierarchy, that he's become practiced and he can probably take those skills out into the public, and that could help him potentially deceive his future victims.
Iheanacho serves just 3 months of his 8-month sentence and is released on the 31st of May, 2016.
The law decrees that the appropriate sentence that reflects the crime, but in order to motivate people to rehabilitate and to show that they can behave themselves, they're released after half. That's the policy. I'm not condoning it or criticising it, but that's how it is.
When a prisoner is released early, they're let out on licence. This means Iheanacho must be supervised by probation and has conditions applied to his release.
His probation conditions was that he was to inform the probation service of any new relationship that he was in, any new address that he was in, and also that he wasn't to be left unsupervised with a child under 16, which related to a previous assault for which he was convicted on a 13-year-old boy.
On leaving prison, Iheanacho was meant to be placed in what's called an approved premises. But there was a shortage.
The whole point about being in an approved premises is that you are being given programmes and courses and curfews are being enforced, but it is a programme to help that person to keep out of further troubles. But unfortunately, as we know, accommodation is a scarce resource, and many people leave prison without a fixed address.
Initially, Iheanacho goes to live with his sister and is assigned a probation officer to supervise him. Unfortunately, she was new to the job and struggling with a heavy workload.
If they'd done some home visits where he should have been in other premises, when he should have been actually residing with his sister, they would have found out that if they did regular home visits, that he wouldn't have been at those premises.
Within just a few weeks of leaving prison, Iheanacho moves in with Lilia and her son Alex, now 5. He never tells probation that he's in a relationship, let alone that he's living with someone. But he makes no secret of it. His probation officer even rings him on Lilia's phone. Few questions are asked.
Lilia remarks that whenever Marvyn was speaking to the probation officer, they were always laughing and joking around, especially when they were on the phone. And the fact that the probation officers weren't knocking on the door every day reassured her that he's probably safe, which obviously he wasn't.
Probation has the right to inform Lilia of Marvyn's long history of domestic violence, but failed to do so.
The probation officer that Marvyn was assigned has later admitted that she was afraid of him. The aura that he presented was so violent, and obviously he was a big guy as well. Someone who was fully aware of his criminal past was rightfully slightly scared to be around him.
Lilia sees Marvyn very differently.
He just pretended to be a good guy pretty well, and even his close friends, who he'd been in secondary school, and he introduced me to, they never knew about any of his convictions.
Lilia described the start of their relationship as happy, and in particular that he was very good with Alex and wanted to bond with Alex.
He did listen to him. He told him go to bed. He would go to bed, and he would like him to read books for him as well at nighttime. And I just felt at the time that it was a good thing.
But unbeknownst to Lilia, there was a dark side to her new partner.
We do know that, from a diary entry, that unknown to Lilia, that Marvyn describes an incident where Alex had been sick in the car and he'd beat him or hit him, certainly.
Marvyn writes, "Do I really love Alex? Even though I had to beat him just now for puking in the cab? Why, I say."
It was a ticking time bomb because of his nature and the character that he was, prone to explosive fits of rage and temper. The writing was on the wall that something was going to happen.
Iheanacho is now out of prison and breaching many of his release conditions. Why isn't probation holding him to account for this? Having served his sentence, he was supposed to inform probation if he was in a new relationship, and indeed if there were children involved in that relationship. He was specifically told to stay away from children.
I think one thing that strikes me about Iheanacho's story is that he had this almost jovial relationship with his probation officers. So he's reportedly laughing with them over the phone. So I think we're seeing his charm and his manipulation coming out. And they were also obliged to do some background checks to make sure that any future relationships were safe and away from children.
Yeah, that's a big hole in the practice on this occasion. There's no question about it. The probation officer should have known about his domestic circumstances. If they knew that he had been lying about where he was living, that he was living with a woman and a child, that's quite serious. That's very serious.
But in this particular case, just to jump in, this particular case, Lilia, his partner, had been on the phone. They could hear a child in the background. If probation had decided to enact upon those breaches, what could they have done? What would they have done?
Well, they could have recalled. There's no question about that. They had it within their gift. And that's possibly and probably what should have happened ultimately.
I think an even more basic strategy would have been to have made contact with Lilia, to give her the opportunity to learn about Iheanacho's background, his domestic violence, and allowed her to make an informed decision about whether she wanted to continue the relationship or not.
Well, it's important not to look for excuses and to take responsibility for the issues that arose. But this was a probation officer, in this case, I understand, who was pretty well brand new, who was given an almost unmanageable caseload from the outset.
So for me, this is a case of the squeakiest wheel gets the grease. So if you've got a caseload with so many different dangerous potential offenders, the one who's causing you the least problems, who's not getting arrested for drunken disorderly misconduct, or it's not having domestic violence incidents with the police coming, like Iheanacho, then you're going to spend less resources and less attention on him compared to the other people on your caseload.
Frankly, there was a mistake made. There's no question about that. And Lilia should have been informed about the person she was living with. It should have happened.
Marvyn Iheanacho has a long history of domestic violence. He's now living with a new partner and her young son. It's a recipe for disaster, and before long, things will come to a tragic conclusion.
The probation service is aware of the relationship with Lilia, but fails to monitor it. Neither does it tell Lilia that under the terms of his release, Iheanacho is not allowed unsupervised access to children under the age of 16. On November 20th, 2016, Iheanacho takes Alex out to run some errands.
Iheanacho announced during the afternoon that he was in fact going to go to get some DVDs and he would take Alex with him. And so Lilia put a coat on Alex and off they went.
On the way home, Iheanacho takes Alex to the playground at Mountsfield Park in Lewisham.
So we're on that Sunday, late afternoon, early evening, by the time Marvyn and Alex are in the park, it's now dark.
When Marvyn and Alex were getting up to leave from the playground, he noticed that one of the shoes was missing, and this was the trigger that flipped the switch. And while obviously a child losing a shoe can be annoying or slightly frustrating, his reaction was completely out of proportion.
And then the next piece of evidence we have is that at about 6 p.m. that evening, witnesses on the other side of the park, near a different exit, overheard an argument. And that argument involved essentially a grown man shouting and swearing at someone about losing a shoe, which is exactly what had happened. In fact, what was overheard was banging on an iron grate, shouting and swearing, and a little boy's voice saying sorry very quietly.
Witnesses to the incident could only hear what was happening, but even from their testimony, it was almost frightening to listen to in court. The way that he kind of used potentially both fists in rapid succession to beat on a child who was, you know, tiny. And then Alex was replying with, I'm sorry. But Marvyn just had kind of blinders on, and he was beside himself with rage.
There were some dog walkers in the park, and what they described as seeing is a man on the telephone, Marvyn Iheanacho, and a young boy, Alex, lying on his back on a bench with his arm dangling by his side.
Iheanacho calmly rings Lilia. He's already trying to disguise what he's done.
He was telling her about the lost shoe, and they were in the park trying to find the shoe. I think at one point he said that Alex was asleep.
Shockingly, Iheanacho doesn't seek medical help. CCTV shows him carrying Alex's limp body down the street.
What was notable was that Marvyn Iheanacho left the park and decided to walk to the cab office and take a cab journey all the way back to Lilia's house, which in fact took over 20 minutes, when the hospital was a 5-minute walk from the park.
When they reach Lilia's home, she notices marks on Alex's face. Iheanacho attempts to cover his tracks.
So when Lilia asked Marvyn about the marks on the face, what he did say is that trying to wake Alex up, that he did say that he was trying to slap Alex. He was already trying to think his way out of these injuries in his explanation.
Alex is unconscious. Iheanacho suggests putting him in the bath to try and revive him. His eyes remain closed.
Lilia began to get more desperate and started screaming at him. This then caused him to lose his temper with her, and he assaulted her.
His response was to knee her in the chest. He then started choking her, and he choked her up to the point where she couldn't breathe. And then suddenly he stopped, and he walked over to Alex and picked him up and moved him to the bed. And it's in that short window that Lilia was able to grab a phone and call 999 and get an ambulance to come as soon as possible.
Alex is rushed to Lewisham Hospital, where a CT scan identifies severe brain swelling. In an attempt to save his life, he's immediately transferred to King's College Hospital.
Marvyn Iheanacho arrived later at hospital. He gave varying accounts to the medical staff there about what happened, and it ranged from falling over onto the ground, falling from a climbing frame, at one point coming down an incline and banging his head on the floor. And also, I think at one point he said that Alex might have been on his shoulders and fallen to the floor. So there were these varying accounts which clearly raised alarm for the medical team.
The police are called. On arrival, they separate Iheanacho and Lilia to interview them.
Well, one of the things that you always ask them to do is to tell the story without interruption, and then you start to kind of look for the discrepancies within their story.
Iheanacho persuades Lilia to say she was with him in the park when Alex was injured. Initially, she goes along with this, but when she finds out that Alex's life is in danger, she breaks down and starts to tell the truth.
It was during this interview that she was also able to show some bruising on her neck and her chin from when she was being strangled by Marvyn.
She told the police about what had happened in the flat, the way that Marvyn had tried to prevent her from making the 999 call, and the assault on her in the process of him doing that.
Iheanacho is charged with causing Alex grievous bodily harm, or GBH.
The clock is ticking from that point, and from his arrival at the police station. We have a limited period of time to get to a point where we release somebody or we charge somebody.
The police move fast, interviewing witnesses, gathering CCTV material and analysing Iheanacho's mobile phone calls to Lilia. In the park, they quickly find Alex's shoe.
That was really a heartbreaking moment for me when I was reporting on the story, because it felt like if it wasn't November and if it wasn't, the evening time, this might have been avoided just by the fact that there was daylight. They were able to just see the shoe so clearly.
2 days after Alex is admitted to hospital, he's pronounced dead. Assault could now turn to murder.
For the next 8 months, Iheanacho was held in prison on remand. Even from prison, he uses a mobile phone to try and turn things in his favour.
Marvyn got a hold of a mobile phone and was able to contact Lilia in an attempt to interfere with the evidence that she was giving or had given.
Mobile phones are, to a degree, worse than drugs in prison. They are relatively easy to smuggle in. The smallest one I've seen is about half the size of your thumb. They lead to drug deals, they lead to violence, they lead to bullying, they can be used to intimidate witnesses.
Iheanacho has never accepted blame for anything. This could be behind his entire history of offending. It's a classic symptom of narcissism, the mental disorder experts believe is the cause of his violent fits of rage.
You will believe that he acted in an understandable way, that others would have acted in the same way and if they were put in the same scenario. We do know that narcissism matches onto one facet of psychopathy. So if we were looking at him having also kind of wider antisocial behaviour, we would be starting to think about a psychopathic individual.
Marvyn Iheanacho is on remand awaiting trial for the murder of 5-year-old Alex. How could the loss of a shoe trigger such a violent reaction, and could this have been predicted? So when Iheanacho finally commits this catastrophic act, what do you think was the key trigger for that?
It's hard to really know without knowing what else was going on in his life at that time and during that day. So I wonder if there were other social issues that were making him really frustrated and angry, and then suddenly his perception of this child misbehaving just made him snap out the blue.
Have you come across cases like this where kids are just random triggers for this extreme level of violence?
No, I think it's very unusual and it's very difficult to understand what actually happened. What we are aware of is that he appears to have had a positive relationship with the child. So it may mean that he wasn't going out of his way intending to be violent, but something triggered him.
Some people do commit terrible acts of violence on the spur, but often they would seek immediate medical help. But in this case, that didn't happen.
Absolutely. So Iheanacho had a hospital just around the corner, 5 minutes walk away, I believe, after he'd committed this horrific act of violence against his child. But he didn't decide to go to that hospital. Instead, he went home and he started making excuses about what happened to the child, and he started telling lies. So to me, it really shows how focused he was on just pushing the blame away from himself rather than trying to get the boy immediate medical attention.
It's very difficult to understand why he would be doing that, perhaps a lack of insight how injured this child was, but he was manipulating the situation to cover his tracks, there's no question about that.
And the tragedy was this was a terrible brain injury which requires immediate attention, and certainly swift medical help might have made a difference in this case.
Absolutely. In a different set of circumstances, if he chose to do something else, this young child could still be alive. It just shows his absolute lack of remorse and shame. So he's somebody who's aggressive, impulsive, doesn't care about the law, doesn't care about the rights of other people, doesn't learn from his mistakes. So all of those character traits merge together with what we know about his charm and his ability to manipulate suggests to me that he certainly has some of the clinical traits of being a psychopath.
Iheanacho seemed to have no brakes on his violence, on his rage. So in many ways, this really was a murder waiting to happen.
I'm afraid that's very true. What is very strange about this is that when he lost his temper and badly injured the child, he seemed to calm down enough to carry the child back to the home obviously being devious in doing so, not going directly to the hospital. And then he was able to assault his partner. So that suggests that he regained some control and let the control lapse again. Very concerning.
Not only did he threaten his partner with this dying child in his arms and refused to bring the child to hospital, but subsequently, while on remand, he intimidated Lilia, the child's mother, into lying on his behalf.
I think that just goes to show how much he wanted to weasel his way out of the situation. He had no shame, very little empathy, wasn't concerned about the child's welfare, wasn't concerned about justice. He just wanted to get away with it.
The inquest into Alex's death will reveal disturbing truths about how the probation service and other government agencies failed to protect Lilia and her young son.
After 8 months on remand, Marvyn Iheanacho appears at Woolwich Crown Court and pleads not guilty to murder. For Detective Chief Inspector Tony Lyons, the trial is the culmination of months of hard work.
He maintained his version of events, that Alex had fallen, that he was not responsible for the injuries caused to Alex, and in turn, his subsequent death 2 days after the incident.
The trial takes a terrible toll on Alex's mother, Lilia.
To see Marvyn Iheanacho in the dock, this person that's taken her son from her, makes it all the more difficult and worse for her to manage.
In contrast, Iheanacho cuts an imposing figure.
Marvyn Iheanacho was a very large man with an intimidating presence. And at one point during his cross-examination, when being challenged about his account, he got very close to losing his temper while still in the witness box in front of the jury.
Despite Iheanacho's plea of not guilty, the police are confident they can prove their case. On top of CCTV footage and witness statements, the post-mortem evidence is damning.
The post-mortem examination of Alex by pathologists identified some key significant injuries to the head and also to the stomach, particularly the brain injury, which was significant. The pathologists concluded that they were caused by an assault. It was not caused by an accident.
Iheanacho's history of domestic violence is read out in court. Hearing this for the very first time, Lilia is shocked beyond belief.
The evidence that you're hearing is fairly overwhelming. His criminal convictions that were allowed to be sort of discussed in court made it hard to feel as though this could have been an accident.
The jury leaves court and deliberates for 6 hours.
I'm feeling nervous about the result. I'm feeling hopeful that the right result is going to be reached for Lilia and her family and Alex's father, and that the results of all my team's hard work and efforts are going to reap rewards. And a very dangerous, violent individual is going to be locked up for a significant amount of time.
The jury returns a unanimous verdict of guilty. Iheanacho is sentenced to life with a minimum of 18 years to serve. This was later increased in appeal to a minimum of 21 years.
I thought it was a fair sentence. Of course, what many people don't realise is that life imprisonment can mean life imprisonment. 21 years is the minimum he must spend behind bars before even eligible for release. It doesn't mean he will be released. That's the earliest time at which he can be considered to be released.
The inquest into Alex's death is highly critical of the probation service. Upon Iheanacho's release from prison, he was classified as a medium risk to children. If he'd been classified as high risk, he would have had much closer supervision.
The judge said in his sentencing remarks that when one looked at his previous convictions and his pattern of behaviour, that it really was only a matter of time before this type of incident, that is, the murder, occurred.
The inquest also identifies other failures.
The inquest heard that the probation officer supervising Iheanacho prior to Alex's death had only qualified that year, but was immediately allocated this and other high-risk cases with minimal supervision. In June 2016, the probation officer became aware that Iheanacho was no longer living at his registered address, but he would not confirm where he was living. Failing to give information to probation officers can be grounds for recall to prison, but the officer did not pursue this.
The inquest identified critical failures in the probation service that could have saved Alex Malcolm's life. Could these have been avoided, and why were the warning signs missed? Iheanacho's performance in the witness box during court was quite extraordinary. What does it tell us about him? Here he is, faced with a crime, the like of which he's committed, many, many times before without the catastrophic outcome, and yet he remains in complete denial about the offence.
So deep down he knows he's guilty, he knows what he's done, but there's a number of reasons why he might pretend to on the surface not accept that. So one would be just because of the stigma attached. Even if he doesn't feel remorse about it, other people, the public, the press, people in prison might judge him for that. And another reason could just be that it's easier for him to accept that he's not done something as evil as this.
So he got a 21-year sentence, minimum. Is it likely that at some stage throughout that sentence he will change his position?
It's really hard to say. Having said that, 21 years is a long period of time. It's a long time to reflect on past mistakes and past life. We also know that, generally speaking, personality disorders tend to burn out over time.
What likelihood is it that he will change?
He may well choose to take the options of attending intervention programs. Sometimes prisoners do it because it's something to do rather than be banged up in a cell. Sometimes they do it for the right reasons and they want to change, or they want to test out whether they can change. And he will have a long time to consider those issues.
I mean, my concern is that he was released to kill. Even in 20 years' time, I can't imagine the resources would be any more plentiful. I can't imagine that the number of people going to the system would be any less. Surely the same pressures are going to leave the same risks.
I think the difference in this case is the time period. So whereas before he had short sentences where he feasibly couldn't start long-term rehabilitation, now there's at least the time element that he could go through the process.
I mean, to your mind, what was the key failure that could have saved this young boy's life?
I think, sadly, the probation service took its eye off the ball. They didn't manage the risk that this offender presented, didn't realise initially that he was living with this woman, that there was a child involved in the relationship. Once that became apparent, they should have acted swiftly. And frankly, he should have been recalled for his failure to comply with licence conditions.
I think there's lots of opportunities that were missed. So first of all, there's Iheanacho when he was younger. I don't think he was charged as harshly for his offences as he could have been. And because of his short sentences, there wasn't really the time to engage him in therapy in prison. He's not released to a probation hostel as would be expected. Now, for me, if he was in a probation hostel, then he would have had a higher level of supervision and observation. And on top of all of that, I think that he used his superficial charm to convince them that nothing was wrong. So they didn't have the foresight to make contact with Lilia, for example. And I think it's just a perfect storm of all these factors to go together. And had they been prevented, then I think the outcome could have been prevented as well.
No one can predict how an individual will act. But this is a case where the past convictions painted a vivid picture of what the future might hold. We have systems and organisations in place to protect the public, but if they're not resourced or managed effectively, then unfortunately, the most vulnerable in society will pay the price.
Only parents, obviously, who lost their kids, they will understand what it's like to lose the child. You cannot describe, you cannot put in words what this feels like. Just wake up in a quiet house every morning, go in the bedroom, look at his toys, look at his bed, and everywhere I go, everywhere I look, I see him. It's broke my heart.